As people were not primed to be thinking about the economy, this situation was quite different in 2008 when a serious economic recession received much more extensive media coverage than national security. In the 2008 presidential election, the economy was an important lens through which the public evaluated the candidates, more important than national security. In the case of political candidates, the media have considerable influence over whether a particular individual will receive public attention and whether a particular individual will be taken seriously as a viable contender. Thus, if the media find a candidate interesting, they may treat him or her as a serious contender. Despite possible weakness and shortcomings. For example, in the 2012 Republican presidential primaries, there were positive stories covering New Jersey Governor Chris Christie as a possible candidate, though Christie ultimately did not run. After Christie's successful re-election as governor, however, his political coverage switched from positive to negative as he was the focus of numerous negative stories about an unseemly effort by some in his administration to punish local New Jersey officials by deliberately clogging traffic across the George Washington Bridge, the nation's busiest. This Bridgegate story had a negative priming effect on Christie's formerly positive image, damaging his presidential ambition. Leaked information can come from government officials or independent sources. The media may also report information that is leaked by government officials. A leak is the disclosure of confidential information to the news media. Leaks may emanate from a variety of sources, including whistleblowers, low-level officials who hope to publicize what they view as their bosses' improper activities. In 1971, for example, a minor Defense Department staffer named Daniel Ellsberg sought to discredit official justification for the U.S. involvement in Vietnam by leaking top secret documents to the press. The Pentagon Papers, the Defense Department owned secret history of the war, differing widely from the Pentagon's public pronouncement, were published by the New York Times and the Washington Post after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the government could not block their release. Pentagon credibility was severely damaged, hastening an erosion of public support for the war. Most leaks, though, originate not with low-level whistleblowers, but rather with senior government officials, prominent politicians, and political activists. These individuals cultivate long-term relationships with journalists to whom they regularly leak confidential information, knowing that it is likely to be published on a priority basis in a form acceptable to them. In turn, of course, journalists are likely to regard high-level sources of confidential information as valuable assets whose favor must be retained. For example, during the George W. Bush administration, Louis Scooter Libby, Vice President Dick Cheney, Chief of Staff, was apparently such a valuable source of leak to so many prominent journalists that his name was seldom even mentioned in the newspaper, despite his prominence in Washington and his importance as a decision maker. Through such tactic alliance with journalists, prominent figures can manipulate news coverage and secure the publication of stories that serve their purposes. New technology and online media has taken the cat and mouse game of leak to the new level. WikiLeaks, an independent nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing classified information, posts leaked documents to its website and uses an anonymous Dropbox system so leakers cannot be identified. In recent years, WikiLeaks has released thousands of secret government documents involving instance instances of government corruption, war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq, torture at the Guantanamo Bay detention camp, maps of U.S. military drone attacks on civilians around the world, and numerous embarrassing private communiques sent by U.S. diplomats abroad. WikiLeaks shares its treasure troves of leaked government documents with major international papers, including the New York Times. In July 2007, gunners aboard two U.S. Army helicopters killed more than a dozen people, including two Reuters news staffers in the Iraq suburb of New Baghdad. Reuters subsequently learned that the U.S. military had video footage of the attack, and the news agency tried to obtain the video through the Freedom of Information Act, but without access. The video was leaked to WikiLeaks, however, which released it in April 2010. Shot through an Apache helicopter gunship, the video clearly showed the slaying of a wounded Reuters employee and his would-be rescuers. It led to a worldwide storm of condemnation of the U.S. military action in the Iraq War. In 2013, Edward Snowden, a former employee of the Central Intelligence Agency and contractor for the National Security Agency, disclosed thousands of classified digital documents to journalists and international media in what has been called the most significant leak in U.S. history. The leaks disclosed widespread global surveillance program by the U.S. government working with telecommunication companies. The world learned the NSA was searching millions of emails and instant messaging contact lists and tracking and mapping the location of cell phones. For revealing the mass surveillance program, Snowden has been called a hero, a whistleblower, a dissident, and a traitor. The leaks garnered intense media attention and sparked heated public debates over government surveillance and privacy of information for individuals. Critics of WikiLeaks and Snowden argue that posting government documents online is not journalism, that government must have some secrets, and that the release of some government documents may jeopardize American soldiers and their local allies by revealing their identities. The whistleblower behind the Pentagon Papers, Daniel Ellsberg, defended WikiLeaks, arguing that it has played a vital role in informing the public of government wrongdoings. The political power of the news media vis-a-vis the government has greatly increased in recent years through the growing prominence of adversarial journalism, an aggressive form of investigative journalism that attempts to expose and antagonize the status quo. The national media aggressive use of the techniques of investigation publicly and exposure allow them to inform the public about major news stories. Without such aggressive media coverage, would we have known that Bill Clinton extramarital affairs or Richard Nixon's committee to re-elect the president's illegal break-in to the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate building? Would we have known that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction? Despite claims to the contrary by then President George W. Bush, without aggressive media coverage, would important questions be raised about the conduct of American foreign and domestic policies, including drone attacks, torture, and civil liberty violation? It is easy to criticize the media. It is easy to criticize the media for their aggressive tactics, but would our democracy function effectively without the critical role of the press? Vigorous and critical media are the watchdog of American politics. Broadcast media are regulated by not print media. In many countries, such as China, the government controls media content. In other countries, the governments own the broadcast media, the BBC in Britain, but does not tell the media what to say. In the United States, the government neither owns nor controls the communication network, but it does regulate the content and ownership of the broadcast media. In the United States, the printed media are essentially free from government interference. The broadcast media, on the other hand, are subjects to federal regulations. American radio and television are regulated by Federal Communication Commission, an independent regulatory agency established in 1934. Radio and TV stations must have FCC licenses, which must be renewed every 5 years. Licensing provides a mechanism for allocating radio and TV frequencies to prevent broadcasts from interfering with and garbling one another. License renewals are almost always granted automatically by the FCC. Indeed, renewal requests are now filled with postcards. Through regulation prohibiting obscenity, indecency, and profanity, the FCC has also sought to prohibit radio and television stations from airing explicit sexual and excretory references between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m., the hours when children are most likely to be in the audience. Generally speaking, FCC regulation applies only to the over-the-air broadcast media. It does not apply to cable television, the internet, or satellite radio. As a result, explicit sexual content and graphic language that would run afoul of the rules on broadcast television are regularly available on cable channels. A number of bills have been introduced in recent Congresses to extend the rules to cable TV and satellite radio, but none has succeeded so far. For more than 60 years, the FCC also sought to regulate and promote competition in the broadcast industry, but in 1996, Congress passed the Telecommunication Act, a broad effort to do away with most regulation in effect since 1934. The act loosened restrictions on media ownership and allowed telephone companies, cable television providers, and broadcasters to compete with one another for telecommunication services. Following the passage of the act, several mergers between telephones and cable companies and among different segments of the internet media produced an even greater concentration of media ownership than had been possible since regulation of the industry began in 1934. The Telecommunication Act of 1996. The Telecommunication Act of 1996 also included an attempt to regulate the content of material transmitted over the internet. This law, known as the Communication Decency Act, made it illegal to make indecent sexual materials on the internet accessible to those under 18 years old. The act was immediately denounced by civil libertarians and became the subject of lawsuits. The case reached the Supreme Court in 1997, and the act was ruled an unconstitutional infringement on the First Amendment's rights to freedom of speech, Chapter 4. Although the government ability to regulate the content on the electronic media on the internet has been questioned, the federal government has used its licensing power to impose several regulations that can affect the political content of radio and TV broadcasts. The first of these is the equal time rule. Equal time rule. Under which broadcasters must provide candidates for the same political office equal opportunities to communicate their message to the public. If, for example, a television station sells commercial time to a state's Republican gubernatorial candidate, it may not refuse to sell time to a Democratic candidate for the same position. The second regulation affecting the content of broadcasts is the right of rebuttal, which requires that individuals be given the opportunity to respond to personal attacks made on a radio or television broadcast. In the 1969 case of Red Line Broadcasting Company versus Federal Communication Commission, for example, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the FCC determination that a radio station was required to provide a liberal author with an opportunity to respond to a conservative commentator's attack that the station had aired. For many years, a third important federal regulation was the Fairness Doctrine. Under this doctrine, broadcasters who aired programs on controversial issues were required to provide time for opposing views. In 1985, however, the FCC stopped enforcing the Fairness Doctrine on the grounds that there were so many radio and television stations, to say nothing of newspapers and news magazines, that in all likelihood many different viewpoints were already being presented without each station being required to try to present all sides of an argument. Critics of this FCC decision charged that in many media markets, the media of competing viewpoints is small. During the past several years, Democratic members of Congress, including Nancy Pelosi, John Kerry, and Richard Durbin, had sought to revive the Fairness Doctrine and respond to what they see as the unfairness of conservative talk radio. The rise of online media challenges our thinking about regulation of the media, as it is more difficult, some say impossible, to regulate political content online. The United Nations recently declared that access to the internet is a human right. While this came in response to threats by authoritarian governments against internet access, the Egyptian government, for example, disabled internet access for the entire nation during protests in 2011. The UN's position demonstrates the significance of information technology in modern life. Many authoritarian countries continue to censor the internet, sometimes blocking the transmission of stories that contain specific terms or information from specific websites. The government does have the power to regulate the internet if a website infringes on U.S. copyright laws. In January 2012, the U.S. Justice Department shut down a website, Mega Upload, that ran services for the file storing and viewing. The owners of the Hong Kong-based company in operation since 2005 were arrested on charges of copyright infringements. The U.S. government claimed it had the right to shut down the website because the company used the internet server located in Virginia. The media, democracy, and your future. The free media are essential to democratic government. Ordinary citizens depend on the media to investigate wrongdoings, to publicize and explain governmental actions, to evaluate programs and politicians, and to bring to light matters that might otherwise be known to only a handful of governmental insiders. Without free and active media, democratic government would be virtually impossible. Citizens would have few means through which to know or assess the government's actions, other than the claims or pronouncement of the government itself. Moreover, without active, indeed aggressive media, citizens would be hard-pressed to make informed choices among competing candidates at the polls. Today's media are not only adversarial, but also increasingly partisan. Debates about liberalism and conservatism of the mass media make it clear that many readers and viewers perceive more and more bias in newspapers, radio, and television. Blogs, niche media, social media, and other internet outlets, of course, are often highly partisan, to some extent, increasingly ideological and partisan stridency is an inevitable result of the expansion and proliferation of the news sources. When the news was dominated by three networks and a handful of national papers, each sought to appeal to the entire national audience. This required a moderate and balanced tone so that consumers would not be offended and transfer their attention to a rival network or newspaper. Today, there are so many news sources that few can aim for a national audience. Instead, many target a partisan or ideological niche and aim to develop a strong relationship with consumers in that audience segment by catering to their biases and predisposition. The end result may be to encourage greater division and disharmony among Americans. Has the rise of citizen journalism, social media, and the internet fundamentally changed how political information is gathered and distributed? As more and more Americans go online to read the news and learn about politics, even the definition of journalist is being challenged. Are Twitter feeds from protesters on the ground in Egypt or in an Occupy Wall Street camp example of citizen journalism? In an era of online news, regular citizens create content and distribute the news through personal web pages and blogs. Is this real news or just social media gossip on a global scale? Wikipedia, the free online encyclopedia founded by Jimmy Wales, has millions of pages compiled by legions of volunteers that provide content on virtually every political topic imaginable. Social media, Wikipedia, and all wiki-type sites involve people working collaboratively to write and create information and to transmit knowledge. Is Wikimedia, the future of media? In the 21st century, political campaigns are covered wall to wall by the internet, on newspapers, sites updated through the day, and on blogs, tweets, social media, and cable television. The new digital media are more diverse, more representative of multiple viewpoints, more interactive and participatory, and to many more interesting than traditional news media. Time will tell whether the shift to online news strengthens or harms American democracy. Boom. Done.